Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We are all watching with interest the decisions at the G7 meetings, the defense ministers' meetings, the upcoming plans for the NATO meetings as what the West will really be able to deliver in aid to Ukraine. The war there is getting uglier. There are huge losses on all sides, and it seems almost a stalemate, with the exception, of course, of Mr. Putin's latest plan, which is if you just give me half of Ukraine, I'll go home. Don't think that's an answer, but we will raise all these questions with Marcus Kolga. He is a senior fellow for foreign policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and with the Conference of Defense Associations. He's made 3 trips recently into the Baltic region, just getting back a couple of nights ago. So I'm sure you're on jet lag, but let's just start with promises from the G7 leaders one more time. Too little, too late, something. I feel sorry as I watch President Zelensky go from meeting to meeting, begging for scraps.
Yeah, well, look, it's better than nothing at this point. We spent the past pretty much a year waiting for the Western world to continue supplying those weapons and aid to Ukraine that it so desperately needs. And, you know, we've seen the results of that. I mean, Russia has made incremental gains in Ukraine's east. I think the largest concern is the targeting of civilian infrastructure in eastern Ukraine, the bombs, the cruise missiles, the terror drones that continue to rain on these Ukrainian cities. These are civilian targets that they're hitting. And we're seeing, dozens of people killed, injured every day, every other day. And this is because we've really failed to get our act together to make sure that Ukraine has those basic defensive weapons, those surface-to-air missiles to protect its cities. We haven't done that. And so, you know, these announcements that we're hearing now, the $50 billion loan, I think that's a positive first step. I mean, we should be taking the entire $300 billion that Russia has stashed away in banks in the US, Europe, and Canada and elsewhere. We should be taking all of that, seizing it, and repurposing it for Ukraine. Anyway, this is a positive result for Ukraine, for us. But like I said, it's just a first step. These announcements of new weapons deliveries we're seeing. I just read today that the Czech government it has an initiative to find a million artillery shells for Ukraine. Those shells are starting to flow into Ukraine now. We know that Ukraine will be taking delivery of some new F-16s in the next few months. That will make a difference. So things are looking up, I think, for Ukraine, for President Zelensky and the Western world as we try to defend it and ensure its victory against these barbaric Russian invaders.
I just can't help but think every time we have this discussion, had we moved in with a vengeance right at the beginning, did all of this, belatedly drawn that red line that we should have drawn several times in the last decade against Russia, and just said, you don't get to do this, and we're going to, blast you at this point, that it might have just pushed him back. We would not be having this discussion 3 years later.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. I've been trying to make this argument for quite some time. Had we realized who we were dealing with already back in 2007, there were telltale signs, even going back 24 years, when Vladimir Putin was first appointed prime minister and then president of Russia. We saw who he was then. In 2007, of course, Putin tried to destabilize Estonia. We saw how he was using information operations and influence operations already, again, to destabilize a NATO member. We saw what he was doing. The following year, he attacked Georgia. Then he partnered up with the Syrian regime to level towns and cities across that country, using all sorts of chemical warfare as part of their tactics. We've seen it over and over and over again. Then 2014, of course, with the occupation of Crimea. Every single time, we failed to respond. we fail to impose any sort of costs and consequences. And when we do that with someone like Vladimir Putin, the only language he understands is power and strength. Yeah. It's invited this. We've invited this upon ourselves by failing to impose any sort of consequences or push back against him. And so this is sort of our own making. And we need to, these incremental increases in supply of weapons and such to Ukraine. It's not helpful. We need to go full tilt here. We need to give Zelensky and his forces everything they need, aside from putting boots on the ground ourselves, to defeat this invader. That's the only way that we're going to stop these constant cycles of violence and Vladimir Putin's own neo-imperialist ambitions.
Yeah, I mean, we know what he wants. He wants to recreate the USSR. We don't think that's a good idea. So maybe we should have stepped up and said, that's actually not an option. And we're just going to show you that it's not an option and stop you right here and now. It's sad as I watched President Zelensky, and he does this every day of the week, going to these meetings and standing there and smiling with these G7 leaders and saying, thank you very much, more gruel, sir. I don't know, there's a level of, I feel embarrassed, and I don't know whether that's the right response or not, but I feel sorry that he is in that position.
But thank goodness for the Ukrainian people and for us that he is in that position. Yeah. The stamina that man has demonstrated, the resilience to all of the attacks, the attacks from the Russian side, whether it's in the information space, the threats, the assassination attempts. And you're right. I mean, this having to run across the world all the time, back and forth, basically begging for us to help his people survive, to escape this genocidal war. Thank goodness he has been there to do this for his people and for all of us. I'm not sure that anyone else would have been capable of doing it.
I find the disconnect. I mean, honestly, and people talk about virtue signaling and all of that we decide that we are going to have to bring Palestinians in because they're being treated so bad. We always have a group. We always have a group of victims somewhere that we in the West are going to help with our generosity of spirit, et cetera, et cetera. And I've got quotation marks around that. But then there's an obvious one. There's an ally and a friend and a country, and we can't seem to even mount that. As you say, bits and pieces. Canada put more money on the table. I'm grateful for that. But it's kind of like that we can't see the forest for the trees.
I mean, you bring up a few very important points. I mean, all of these conflicts, not all of them, but most of the conflicts that we're seeing around the world today, if you trace back who's sort of behind them, who's supporting them, who is causing them, all roads lead to Moscow. Vladimir
sometimes
Putin,
through China.
Oh, no, sometimes through China, sometimes through Tehran,
right.
Sometimes through Pyongyang, but, or even Havana for that matter.
Yes. Yeah.
But the point is that Russia is connected to all of this. Vladimir Putin is sparing no expense to cause as much chaos in the world as possible, because he cannot dominate his neighbors or other areas in the world, other parts of Africa that he's trying to recolonize. He can't do any of this work if we are united and standing up against him. And so this is why he's engaging in these sorts of activities. It doesn't matter where you see those conflicts. He likes conflict, and that's what helps keep him in power. So he's going to continue doing this, and we have to realize that. And this is why it is so important for us to support Ukraine and ensure that it does win over Russia, because I think that if Ukraine is able to reestablish its sovereignty over the parts of Ukraine that are currently occupied by Russia, I think that this will represent a major defeat for Vladimir Putin. It will prevent him from engaging in this sort of activity elsewhere. And I think eventually it will lead to a political change in Russia. And that really has to be our objective. We may not say it in Western capitals, but that has to be the objective.
Yeah, if it's not the end game, it should be.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to drill down on. First, we're just going to get your take because you've been in the region, the state of play on the ground. So as you mentioned earlier, they're taking out the electricity. They took out half of the supply just this week. The Russians are using chemical weapons. And I think part of the issue with this being increasingly a drone war, it kind of keeps everybody on the ground in place and in the bunker, but it also makes you a much easier target. And when the Russians have that, if they see Ukrainians dug in, they just dump chemical on them. This is brutal.
Yeah, it's it's like World War I trench warfare all over again, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think that anyone ever imagined that we would be in this situation, but it is. It's just a shooting war, and with these drones, you know, it makes it impossible for anyone to come out of those trenches, because every inch of that front line is being watched on both sides with drones. So, I mean, the situation is extremely grim. I mean, I saw one statistic just today that it appears that there are 1,000 Russian soldiers who are being basically killed or wounded almost every day on the front lines. It's a real meat grinder for both sides of this war, and so it's unlike anything that we've seen certainly in modern times.
And what's your sense, because President Zelensky has had to lower the recruitment age. I mean, they're literally running out of people.
Yeah.
So it's a long time to sustain public support. When you go into a war like this and you've got a leader like Zelensky, people rally. But when families have lost husbands, wives, children to the degree they're losing it, it's hard to keep that strength and that focus.
Yeah, it certainly is. Ukraine is also a democratic state. I think that they respect the rule of law, human rights, and such. President Zelensky doesn't have the same sort of opportunities as Vladimir Putin does.
Right.
Vladimir Putin has no moral conscience. He has no respect for human life. And so Vladimir Putin is drawing upon the resources he has, and that includes some of these extremely economically vulnerable minority groups, ethnic minorities in the far east of Russia, where there's barely any running water or heat. To those families in those rural areas, he's offering families $10,000 if their son never returns, and they're quite happy to take that. That's more money than they'll ever see in their lifetimes. And so he's really exploiting his own people. It's quite vulgar, and this is something that's not really reported too much in the Western media. But I think that's also an opportunity for us. I mean, this is the sort of information, the facts that we should be reporting on with the support of Russian independent journalists, and getting that back into Russia so that Russians themselves are aware of how Vladimir Putin, number one, I mean, he hasn't delivered on any of his domestic promises to the Russian people in the past 24 years. And now he's exploiting them to undertake this absolutely insane and unstrategic war, whose only beneficiary is Vladimir Putin himself.
This leads me to the question of sanctions, and you've been on this all along, sort of saying, it's kind of like your course of antibiotics. There's no sense taking two and throwing the pill bottle out. Like, you've got to run the course. So we talk about sanctions, but we haven't really materialized that sanction. We're getting a little closer. They had this discussion at the NATO meetings about trying to turn those assets liquid and putting the money back into Ukraine. But there's so many loopholes, and the Chinese, we thought, if Europe doesn't buy oil, we'll bring him to his knees. Well, China buys oil and India buys oil, and he's not really feeling that pinch.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, China is exploiting this entire situation itself. It's getting all sorts of very cheap resources from Russia right now. And Russia has become China's, discount gas station at this point.
Yeah.
So Xi has no interest in seeing an end to any of this. He would love this conflict to simmer on indefinitely, because he's really, China's the big winner in all this. On sanctions, and if we just zoom in on Canada, I think we've done a lot of positive things. I think we've failed in many ways. On the positive side, we've really been a leader in terms of freezing and seizing Russian assets abroad, in terms of putting through legislation to repurpose them. And we were the first Western country, your colleague, Senator Omodovar, passed legislation, or introduced legislation about a year and a half ago, that will now allow Canada to basically repurpose oligarch assets that are in Canada. And we're doing that with $25 billion of assets owned by Roman Abramovich, whose company, Abroad Steel, has billions of dollars of assets here in Canada. So this is represents a small portion of them. But the Canadian government is right now moving to seize that small portion of Abramovich's assets. And for your listeners who don't know who Roman Abramovich is, he is a leading Russian oligarch, former owner of Chelsea Football Club, but was instrumental in bringing Vladimir Putin to power in the late 1990s. He was the one that sort of introduced Putin to then President Boris Yeltsin, and now we see the results of that. So we're taking real leadership in terms of that, being the first nation. I know that I was in the Baltics, as you mentioned, several times over the past month and a half. All three, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, are really looking to Canada and this legislation to adopt it themselves. And in fact, the Estonians just about 2 weeks ago basically mirrored the Canadian legislation and was the first European country to pass that. And again, it's thanks to Canadian leadership on that.
That's great.
But in terms of enforcement of sanctions, we got a lot of work to do. We just last March we placed sanctions on imports of Russian titanium. But then a few months later, we issued a sanctions exemption because Bombardier and Airbus asked for these exemptions. And
I was just going to say that we're helping them keep planes in the air. Commercial, but also others, I'm assuming.
Well, this titanium is used not just in bombers and fighters, but also in cruise missiles and other munitions that are being used to destroy Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. So, great that we decided to place sanctions on them, but not so great that we've given these exemptions out to the titanium producers. So there are a number of inconsistencies.
Is there a backstory on that? Like, why would we do that?
Well, my understanding is that President Macron had called the Prime Minister and said, on behalf of Airbus, and said basically, look, we need this titanium to continue producing those jets in Canada. Bombardier is also, I'm sure, made that call. But the reasoning behind it, I thought was a bit suspicious. You have a company like Boeing who also uses titanium in their airplanes they manufacture. But in February of 2022, they immediately came out and said, we are going to terminate our contracts with this Russian supplier, and we're going to look elsewhere for our titanium. Bombardier and Airbus, the companies operating here in Canada, have had 2.5 years to wean themselves off this titanium. Yeah. And the justification for the exemption was that, well, we're going to give these companies time to slowly wean off this titanium. Well, what on earth were they doing the past 2.5 years? I'll tell you what they were doing. They were getting cheap titanium from the Russians and exploiting the situation. So I would say that, fine, if workers are going to get laid off because of this, why don't we impose a sanctions tariff then? What about let's increase the cost of that titanium by 400% and take those proceeds and give them to Ukraine then?
Yeah. No, this is I think this is the frustration that we see when we look at all of this. I want to put this in the larger context now, because we're seeing some very significant political shifts. what just happened with the European Parliament and the move to the right. Now, I don't subscribe to the view that this is, some crazy, the right wing is taking over the world. I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction with what they've seen from more liberal Western governments. But it is happening, and it will mean a shift in attitudes towards Ukraine and support for Ukraine, because we see those differences. Watching President Biden at these meetings where he is not, fully there, and I think that must make it difficult for people when they see a Western leader like that. How do you see this? The political wins and an election coming in the U.S. in November.
Well, I mean, I think we have to look at those results in Europe a little bit more closely. I think that the gains made by the far right were in European nations that aren't directly affected by the war right now. They're not all that close to the front lines. If you look at nations like the Baltic states, those that are close to the front lines, I think that the center held more or less. I think that we should be concerned that the far right overall did make gains in countries like, Germany, France, Austria. But that doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, if you look at the overall composition of the European Parliament, the center is still holding. Yes, the far right has made gains, but I don't think there's any reason to, hit the panic button at this point.
As Mr. Macron did.
Well, I think Mr. Macron is in a different situation, I think, in France. The rise of the National Front in France is of concern. And so, it's a bit of a gamble that he took. Let's hope that things turn out well for him in that election. But I mean, France is one nation that we should be concerned about those results in.
I mean, and they're a key supporter, right, of Ukraine.
Macron certainly has.
Yeah.
Macron has been from being one of the most reluctant supporters to being one of the most vocal supporters. And so Europe definitely needs his leadership and that voice right now. And it'll be there. I mean, we're not talking about a presidential election. We're talking about parliamentary elections. So Macron will remain there for some time yet. But certainly, I mean, it would be important to have the entire French government support these efforts.
Give us your take on the U.S. I mean, watching, as I said, a very frail Joe Biden at these meetings, guided by the Italian, people kind of trying to keep him in the group, and knowing that election is coming. That could be very significant if Trump wins.
It could be significant, or it may not be.
Tell us what you think about that.
I think that, I think Trump has had some positive effects on, Western collective security. His threats to pull the plug on those countries that aren't meeting their 2% expectations,
including us.
Well, we'll see what happens with this new Arctic strategy that's coming out. Yes. But no, I mean, we're seen as, unfortunately, as laggards. I mean, you hear this in some of the capitals that I've been to. There's always this question about what's Canada doing? Why are they not living up to that 2%? And I also get that reminder. People ask me, can you remind the government that 2% is a baseline. That is the bottom line. 2% is not the ceiling. You need to meet that 2%. And so, and then you look at these smaller countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who are spending just that amount on their support for Ukraine. They are really doing a lot of this heavy lifting. So it is a little bit embarrassing for us. And I think that Canada should be concerned if Donald Trump does win. It appears that he may just win. I think that our defense arrangements are going to be scrutinized by Trump if he does become president. NORAD is up in the air. Our Arctic defense, there's a big question mark there, because we really have failed to acknowledge the threats in the Arctic. Russia has, as I think you and I have talked about before, Russia has been rapidly militarizing the Arctic. They put in a claim to every inch of seabed underneath the Arctic Sea.
Along with the Chinese on that one as well.
Yeah, and I mean, Russia has been very aggressive in this regard, and that claim that they put in comes right up to our 200-mile economic exclusive zone, so right up to our border. And just last December, the head of Russia's Navy said very publicly, with Vladimir Putin standing at his side, that Russia in the coming years is going to engage in a massive Arctic expansion. And there have been warnings. The Russian government itself has warned that there is a coming conflict in the Arctic. Now, the question is, who is going to start that conflict? Well, it's probably that country that has been starting conflicts over and over again for the past 15 years. And so we've sort of failed to, I think, recognize and acknowledge that threat. Well, we've been slow. We haven't responded at all to it. We're only thinking about that now. And I think that the common thinking in Ottawa when I've brought this up is that, the Americans, the cavalry will come in if something happens up in the Arctic. And if you ask the Americans, what does the cavalry look like when there's a Russian nuclear submarine pops up in Hudson Bay? They say, what are you talking about? We don't have any of that. There's no cavalry. There's no Arctic cavalry. So we're way back. We need to really start focusing on our own borders, on our own sovereignty, and we sort of failed to do that.
Well, Perrin Beatty said it the other day. I mean, the man's a former defense minister who just said, you're not a sovereign country if you can't defend yourself, and if you're just, dependent on the kindness of strangers. Like, we really do have to step this up.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are 100% dependent on the Americans when it comes to defending our own borders. That's not a great place to be when you have someone like Donald Trump potentially coming into power again, and we don't know what's coming after him.
Well, or even the Democrats are not very happy with our inability to protect borders, even on simple questions of migrants and immigration. Like, we can't offer any assistance there. In fact, we just kind of let our borders open too.
Well, and yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the U.S. ambassador repeatedly, when he comes on television, he constantly reminds us that we are not living up to our commitment to 2% spending on defense. It's a regular reminder from him. And so, yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter, Republicans or Democrats, they're paying attention, as are all of our European allies. So we need to become a little bit more serious about our national defense and the collective defense of our allies.
Do you get any sense of that? I saw Blair, he's at the meeting of defense ministers, and he said, yes, we're gonna get to that 2%. I don't know, been listening to it for a decade, but and much longer. I guess my response at this point, or my concern at this point, is in what time frame? I mean, we're right up against it now. When you're looking at the potential in the Middle East, what we're witnessing, the bloodbath in Ukraine, like, this is not some esoteric idea where we should have another couple of conferences and contemplate what our defense spending commitment should be.
Don't get me started. No, I mean, I think we like having those conferences, and it's so much easier to just admire the problem and then kick actually, looking at solutions and implementing solutions down the road, right? And that's sort of what we've been doing all along. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we need to address this problem right now. It's not a year or two out. It's not 5 years out. This is a problem right now, because there is no evidence whatsoever right now that the conflicts that we're seeing right now are going to end anytime soon. The only evidence that we have is that there are more and more of these conflicts happening.
Yeah.
We haven't even touched upon Africa, which is an area that, a continent that I keep an eye on, and to
Exactly.
see, keeping an eye on what the Russians and the Chinese government is doing there. Our own backyard. I mean, we just had a Russian nuclear submarine pop up in the bay in Havana.
Yeah.
We're not paying attention to what's happening in our own backyard. I mean, Mexico, for example, in terms of the information space, Russian state media is the number one watched news in Mexico as far as foreign newscasts are concerned. These nations are very active in our own backyard. They are having influence in those countries. And we're simply not paying any attention, whether it's in the information space, whether it's our military, defense, national stuff, none of it. And so we need to start taking all of this a little bit
The
more
balloons
seriously.
are flying over North America, and we are busy passing legislation to try and control bad things on the internet. It does just seem to be way out of, well, just way out of focus and way out of proportion.
But I think that we can do both things. There's no reason why we can't look at cleaning up our, social media and our information spaces, but also make sure that, our borders are secure, that those nations that we're allied with, that their borders are secure, and that our troops, for instance, who are in Latvia, have the equipment that they need, that there are sufficient numbers of them, and that we have sufficient numbers of troops just in our armed forces, because that's also a problem. And we're just don't seem to be doing any of this.
And we're reading these stories on a daily basis of the recruitment issues because of the rules we've imposed on recruitment and how we want to change the face of the military, but it is taking the obvious recruiting base and ignoring it,
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of problems when it comes to what they call forced generation or recruitment. I think there's been over the past decade, some of the media stories that we've seen about our armed forces. There's been a slow demoralization of our armed forces. The conditions that they have to work under aren't great, and we haven't been particularly strategic about our foreign deployments. The deployment in Latvia, we should be making that a permanent deployment. We should make that announcement. Allow those troops, and I'm thinking about our troops that are serving there, so that they're not just going in on a rotation away from their families for extended time. Let them bring their families there. Let their kids be educated there. Latvia is a modern European nation. It's not some far off place where, the culture is that foreign. All the troops that I've spoken to all seem to like it.
As a training program, we put the new recruits over there for 6 weeks and say, practice how to put your uniform on and put your, gun on your, like I've talked to some of these guys, like they're ready. They joined the Canadian forces because they were prepared to do what it takes. And they're not even being allowed to do that. Never mind, they don't have the right equipment or helmets or the appropriate, gear and kit to do this. Like, I don't see anywhere where we're really trying to, at least, even if our contribution is small, at least get that part right.
Yeah. And there's so many other problems that we're looking at, but this is one area that we need to we really do need to focus on. And like I said, I mean, I think when we're talking about our troops in Latvia, I know that, talking to the Latvian government, cabinet ministers, just regular people in Latvia, they all recognize that we're over there. They really appreciate it because, as I said, I mean, I've been there several times over the past month and a half. You can feel the tension in those nations. I mean, they're really concerned about what's coming next. And so our presence there really is, I mean, it's called Operation Reassurance for a reason, and it's actually doing that. It's a good news story. We should be, and the government really should be focusing on this. They should be actually, ensuring that the media is covering it so that, future generations who are thinking about considering joining the military, they see this as maybe an opportunity and a reason to join. So, I just think that I wouldn't say that we've bungled it, but we've missed a lot of opportunities when it comes to.
And I mean, we're seeing the Europeans talk about, mandatory service, be it civilian or military. I mean, I think other parts of the world are looking at the same picture we're looking at and saying, maybe we need to be thinking about this in a different way and
Yeah.
getting next gen focused on whatever their contribution might be, but that it is going to take a contribution.
Yeah, it is going to take a bit more of a contribution than we're all currently making. I mean, I don't think that we'll ever be able to move into the sort of situation that you do see in a lot of European nations, whether it's the Finns or maybe Estonians, Latvians, where there is a mandatory service conscription by anyone turning 19. Those countries need that because they are right on the border. They're small, and I don't think that the Canadian Canadian voters would ever accept something like that. And so then we need to think about other ways that of attracting people into our armed forces, because you're right. I mean, right now recruitment numbers are terribly low, and it's becoming a national security potential issue, and eventually even a national security crisis.
Yeah. Well, this has been cheery and uplifting, as it always is when we have these conversations. How is the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Is kind of how. But you always have a note of optimism in there somewhere that we're doing. I know not much, but that we're doing something as opposed to nothing. But I always come back to that, which is kind of half measures or sometimes worse than no measures.
Yeah, look, I don't think that we're any worse or better than our allies. There are some things that we are doing really well, and I wanted to highlight one thing that we are doing very well, and that's working with the Ukrainians to try and bring home those 20,000 Ukrainian children who've been kidnapped by Russian armed forces and who are being indoctrinated right now in Russia and may one day be put on the front lines. And we're really working hard with them to try and bring those children home. So there are several examples where we are doing very well. It's just, sometimes we do focus on the gaps a little bit too much, and there is more that we could be doing.
No, and thank you for your work on that, and as you say, for educating the media in Russia itself so that they can inform their public, because we know it also has to come from the inside. So
yeah, and that's very positive too, that the Canadian government is supporting projects to do that, because that is a way of, and it's very unique that Canada is contributing to this effort to go on the offensive when it comes to information warfare. So we'll see how that plays out, but that's also, it's very innovative and positive that the government is doing this work.
Yeah. See, we found one. We found some. We found a note of optimism. Marcus Kolga. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and works with with a lot of projects overseas in the Baltic region. And I know you don't want to get into all the details of that, but we know what you're doing is good work. So thank you very much for being with us again today.
Likewise, thank you, Senator, for always keeping an eye on these issues and being such a strong advocate for all of these issues as well. And so thank you so much for having me on today as well. It's always a pleasure.
All right, Marcus. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We will see you again soon. And Marcus, I'll see you again soon, too. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.